Hola, buenas noches. Bueno, queríamos darle la bienvenida a todos. Bueno, agradecerles por estar acá. Para nosotros es una alegría recibir a Sara y poder realizar una charla como esta dentro del marco de la Fotogalería. Así que bueno, aquí les cedo la palabra a mis compañeros para los agradecimientos y presentar a Sara. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Tan solo unas palabras de agradecimientos literales, primero al Complejo Teatral de Buenos Aires, por hacer posible esto también, a la sala Lugones, que nos prestó muy amablemente el espacio, y fundamentalmente a Inés Katzenstein y a Sarah Meister por estar acá esta noche y por el placer que significa todo eso. Le paso el micrófono a Ariel.
Hola, buenas noches. Bueno, quería hacer una breve introducción de Sara. Para los que no saben quién es, Sarah Meister es curadora en el Departamento de Fotografía del MoMA, es codirectora del August Sander Project, docente del curso Seeing Through Photographs y coeditora, a la vez que autora, de la serie de 3 libros Photography en MoMA. Sus proyectos recientes en el MoMA incluyen Frances Benjamin Johnston, The Hampton Album, Making Space, Women Artists and Postwar Abstraction, y One and One is Four, The Bauhaus Photocollage of Joseph Albers. Su trabajo se concentra en los temas y figuras claves que han tenido lugar a lo largo de la historia de la fotografía. Actualmente se encuentra trabajando sobre la obra de Dorothea Lange y el Fotocine Clube Bandeiranchi de San Pablo. Bueno, sin más, invitamos a Sara. Escuchamos un poco la charla de ella y después, bueno, abrimos la charla para las preguntas y para un poco más la charla. Bueno, gracias.
Thank you. Good evening. Buenas noches. Unfortunately, that's about the extent of my ability to speak Spanish. So my apologies for speaking to you tonight in my native language, English. I really appreciate you all making the effort to be here in this gorgeous historic theater. For which the invitation to speak, I'm grateful to my dear friend and colleague Inez Katzenstein. It was her idea to introduce me to Bruno Dubner and to his colleagues Laura Marmor and Ariel Autier, and the generous invitation to speak about something that I know quite well, photography at MoMA. My plan is to sketch a little bit of the history of the medium at the museum, and then to speak about some projects that I've had the privilege of developing over the last few years. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about the future, and then we'll have questions. This should give you a good sense of what it's like to have been and to be a curator at MoMA. I'm here in Buenos Aires with Inez Cisneros, who is now the curator of Latin American art at MoMA and the director of the Cisneros Institute for the Study of Art from Latin America, and our director, Glenn Lowry, and several other MoMA colleagues. And the museum is temporarily closed until October 21st, and we are taking advantage of this moment to share our exciting plans for the new MoMA with friends around the world. But tonight, it's all about photography. So while I'm happy to answer any questions about the museum during the Q&A, I will begin by highlighting this recently acquired work by Facundo Duzaviria that we are thrilled to have in the museum collection. When the Museum of Modern Art was founded nearly 90 years ago, its founding director, Alfred Barr, had a plan to, quote, expand beyond the narrow limits of painting and sculpture to include departments departments devoted to drawings, prints, and photography, the arts of design, architecture, stage designing, furniture, and the decorative arts. Not the least important collection might be the Filmotheque, a library of films, end quote. And among the museum's founders and trustees, the appetite for such experimentation was not exactly matched, but Barr was clever, and when he had the opportunity to hire a librarian, he chose a young scholar named Beaumont Newhall, whom he knew had a keen interest in photography. In this photograph, taken on the steps of the museum's second home on West 53rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, where the museum remains today, we see the entire museum staff in 1937. Beaumont Newhall is the tall fellow on the right, and Alfred Barr, with dark hair and glasses, is standing just next to him. As librarian, Newhall was able to collect a few photographs, but he is better known today for his landmark exhibition, Photography, 1839 to 1937, one of the earliest attempts to sketch a history of the medium that was then not quite 100 years old. The entrance to this exhibition declared just how much the medium had changed since its inception, from the bulky camera obscura to the handheld Leica. And at the same time, these two views of the same entrance acknowledge the photography's capacity to deceive. The exhibition included over 800 works, filling the entire townhouse that was then the museum, and its catalog would be the basis for a book called The History of Photography, which was so influential that it was the textbook that I used to study photography at Princeton University in the 1990s. The exhibition was exceptional for many reasons, but it might come as a surprise to know that the presence of photography on the walls of the museum was not one of them. In fact, photography had played a small but significant role in two major exhibitions that Barr had organized the previous year, Cubism and Abstract Art, and Beaumont Newhall was in fact responsible for making this installation view, and Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism, where a photogram by Man Ray was featured on the cover of the original exhibition catalog. I mention this now as a reminder that many of the great principles of our current reinstallation of the collection galleries, such as the integration of different media, have their roots in the earliest years of the museum's history, but I'll return to this soon. Walker Evans' American Photographs is heralded as the first one-person photography exhibition at MoMA, and according to the 1938 press release, that's true. But if you dig just a bit deeper, you'll discover that Walker Evans had another one-person exhibition 5 years earlier. The difference was that in that first exhibition, called Walker Evans Photographs of 19th Century Houses, that was on view in the architecture gallery. It was about the houses. And it was seen as a complement to the concurrent exhibition of Edward Hopper's paintings. This early exploration of American vernacular architecture helped Evans develop his eye as well as his pictorial vocabulary, and his attention to the undersung elements of American culture would find their purest form in American photographs, but the roots of that endeavor began in 1933. In fact, several of the photographs made for that earlier project reappear in the 1938 book and exhibition. But remember, all of this happened before there was a Department of Photography, which wouldn't happen until officially 1940, when Beaumont Newhall was named the first curator of photography. To mark the occasion, Newhall and a photographer named Ansel Adams organized an exhibition called 60 Photographs, a survey of camera aesthetics, the inaugural exhibition of the Department of Photography. This opened to the public on the last day of 1940, and its title signaled a focus on the singular artistic characteristics associated with the medium of photography. With few exceptions, Newhall was drawing from the museum's fledgling collection, using what we would now call vintage prints. That is, prints made by the artist, or at least under their supervision, at or about the same time as the negatives were exposed. We shall see how all this changed when we consider the inaugural exhibitions of each person subsequently in charge of the Department of Photography. And in the early days of the museum, as I mentioned, each staff member wore many hats. So Beaumont Newhall, who had made those installation views for the Cubism show, was also making this one. with a plant replacing the second bench, in case posterity would find this a more interesting way to record the show. I would say that the story of MoMA's installation photographs is a visual table of contents for my talk tonight. Even before he was named curator, Newhall was actively pursuing photographs for the museum collection. One of the first major acquisitions was a gift of more than 100 photographs by Man Ray from the author, collector, and critic James Thrall Sobey, who was not coincidentally also a MoMA trustee. These were on view in Newhall's inaugural exhibition, and he understood that his responsibility was not simply to organize exhibitions, but also to build and care for a collection of photographs. It is the presence of a collection, in fact, that distinguishes MoMA and other museums from art spaces or Kunsthalle. In the United States, I find today it is frighteningly fashionable to apply the word curator to anyone who happens to make a selection of anything. And the verb to curate is equally abused. So we find these curators selecting vendors for a food market, or perhaps curating their closet to arrange things according to some purportedly aesthetic criteria. The root of the word curator, curare, which in Latin means to care for. So my hope is that the increased prominence of the collection and what we do with that at MoMA might help clarify the difference between what Inez and I do every day and the responsibilities of someone making a well-curated playlist for their phone. But I digress. To underscore what a radical proposition it was to collect photographs at that time, I'd like to point to a small exhibition that opened in December 1941. It was called American Photographs at $10. The press release explained, the museum's Department of Photography announces an experimental project, the sale of fine photographs at $10. 9 American photographers have agreed to make special editions of 10 duplicate prints, especially for this purpose. The framed prints will be exhibited at the museum, which will then take orders for duplicate prints. And the list of participating artists reads like a who's who of 20th century photography. Berenice Abbott, Ansel Adams, Walker Evans, Helen Levitt, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Charles Sheeler, Edward Weston, Brett Weston. These people all agreed to participate, and the proceeds were intended to go to the photographers, but unfortunately, there weren't any. There is a letter in the museum's archives from Beaumont Newhall to Laszlo Moholy-Nagy that I love, and it's at the conclusion of the exhibition in which he regretfully reported that only one of the prints of this iconic image from the Radio Tower Berlin had sold, and he concluded in the letter, "Perhaps we shall have better luck next time." But there wouldn't be a next time for Newhall. The attacks on Pearl Harbor, which precipitated the United States' entry into World War II, occurred just days after the exhibition opened, which might explain some of the problem. And Newhall would leave the museum soon thereafter to serve as a first lieutenant in the Army. In any case, by the time the war ended, the museum was looking to have someone with more popular taste lead the department, moving away from Newhall's ostensibly elitist aesthetics. They found this in Edward Steichen, whose astoundingly multifaceted career would lead him from the rarefied air of Alfred Stieglitz's little galleries of the photo secession to the utilitarian barracks of the United States Air Force during World War I, to the glamorous studios of Condé Nast magazines and beyond. During World War II, Steichen was a guest curator for 2 wildly popular exhibitions at MoMA, The Road to Victory and Power in the Pacific, and their success made his appointment in 1947 seem almost inevitable. Steichen's inaugural exhibition as the director of the Department of Photography has often been overshadowed by the wartime exhibits that preceded it and his crowning curatorial achievement, The Family of Man, which would follow in 1955.
But in this exhibition, In and Out of Focus, a survey of today's photography, it's a helpful lens through which to understand this era. The exhibition design was the work of Herbert Matter, a dramatic departure from the restraint of Newhall's inaugural exhibition, where all of the prints, you remember, were matted and framed, hung in a single line. Many of the prints in this exhibition, and in fact in many of Steichen's exhibitions at MoMA, were new and made according to the demands of the exhibition design, without considering the opinions of the photographers. Today, this disregard for the materiality or scale preferred by an artist would be almost inconceivable. Several of the works included in and Out of Focus, including this one by Irving Penn, are now established highlights of the museum collection. But it's worth remembering that Penn's photograph of the principal dancers for the American Ballet Theater was made for Vogue magazine and made in 1947, only the year before that exhibition. I find this inspiring as an expression of Steichen's attentiveness to contemporary practices, and I should mention, out of fairness, that many of the pictures that Newhall was showing were also newly made then as well. But it also inspires me as a recognition of the expansiveness of the photographic media, the porous boundaries of the many traditions, including magazine work, that comprise the history of photography, which are still today a central enlivening principle. The next director, John Sherkovsky, like Steichen, had been a photographer before becoming a curator, and he assumed the role of director of the Department of Photography in 1962. He called his first exhibition 5 Unrelated Photographers, which was a not-so-subtle rebuke to Steichen, whose exhibitions betrayed an affinity for thematic groupings, most notably in the family of man. By contrast, Sherkovsky pointedly remarked of this first exhibition in the press release, quote, "The exhibition does not include their work, it is of it. No attempt is made to link them together with a central theme or idea." Ouch. But I would like to point out a similarity with Steichen's installation practices. You might note that the photographs on the wall are unmatted, unframed, and rhythmically placed in a quite poetic way that probably had nothing to do with the photographers at all. Sherkovsky is better known for New Documents, an exhibition which would open 4 years later without a catalog, and about which the museum published this book on the 50th anniversary of the landmark exhibition. I find it fascinating, if not all that surprising, that while Newhall was actively pursuing acquisitions of important historical and contemporary work for the collection, neither Steichen nor Sherkovsky prioritized acquisitions with the same fervor, with one notable exception, which I'll mention in a moment. So, for instance, the museum has not one print from the family of man. We have duplicate prints, but not one from that exhibition. And while Sherkovsky acquired some work by Arbus, Friedlander, and Winogrand, there was no systematic effort to build a representation of their achievements in the collection. I suspect this has to do with the fundamental reproducibility of the medium. As I just mentioned, both Steichen and Sherkovsky would regularly make prints for their exhibitions, which was certainly at odds with the veneration of artists' original prints that Newhall had embraced, and that remains prevalent today, in fact. But I think it was also related to the general immaturity of the market. None of these prints were worth anything, really, although perhaps the museum's practices had something to do with that. For Sherkovsky, close relationships with these photographers could have diminished any sense of urgency, at least until Arbus's suicide in 1971. So this is not to say that Steichen or Sherkovsky acquired no photographs for the museum collection, but it was certainly of secondary interest. The one major exception that I alluded to before was Sherkovsky's acquisition of the Abbott-Levy collection of work by Eugene Atget, comprised of nearly 5,000 distinct prints, most of the contents of Atget's studio at the time of his death in 1927, this was a central priority for Tchaikovsky from the moment he came to the museum, and it took him more than 5 years to make it happen. This prescient acquisition has been the backbone of numerous subsequent publications and exhibitions, and it's central as well to our ability to explore the crossroads between photography as art and photography as documentation. And this, like the magazine work, is a uniquely fertile territory for photography. This democratic, utilitarian possibilities of the medium, which are so exquisitely expressed in Atget's work, remain urgent and inspiring today as ever. Jumping forward once more, after Tchaikovsky's retirement, Peter Galassi became chief curator of the Department of Photography in 1991, and his inaugural exhibition in that role, More Than One Photography, argued for another aspect of the porosity of the photographic medium. The fact that photography played a central role in the practices of many artists who would not consider themselves photographers at all. This was a forward-looking gesture, and Galassi was committed to putting what he perceived to be two different worlds in dialogue with one another. The art world, represented here by artists such as Felix Gonzalez Torres and Christian Boltanski, with the photography world, meaning artists like Mikhail Schmidt, whose work drew from specifically photographic, often descriptive traditions. I might argue that it is a signal of Galassi's success that these distinctions no longer seem that necessary. The market for photographs began to emerge in the 1970s, and by the 1990s there was widespread awareness that collecting photographs would be an increasingly expensive endeavor, and that the opportunities for acquiring work, especially rare or unique prints, would be increasingly scarce. We began to look more systematically at the weaknesses of the collection and with living photographers. So we were acquiring work by Jane Groover, William Wegman, Lucas Samaras, as well as important historical moments. The single most important acquisition of Galassi's tenure was the Thomas Walter collection of over 300 photographs, including this one by Edmund Kesting. And it addressed what one might characterize as the most surprising weakness of the museum collection: modernist photography between the world wars, which Newhall had been championing since 1937. I'm keen to save time to talk about my own projects and our current moment, so I will simply mention that the Walter acquisition was not only significant for the opportunities that it since provided to present this key moment in photography's history, but also because it prompted a major research initiative, the results of which are all online, and I encourage you, if you're curious, to look at them. If you Google MoMA object photo, you'll find it. I love this increased attentiveness to photography's material history, to the consideration of photographs as objects rather than images, and I find that in the digital era, when so many people are experiencing photographs digitally or virtually, that this interest is refreshingly widespread. So perhaps this is as good a moment as any to mention Seeing Through Photographs, an online course that I developed in collaboration with my colleagues in the Departments of Education and Digital Media, which is available for free on a platform called Coursera. I'm humbled by the more than 200,000 students who have enrolled in this course, all of whom seem as keen as I am to use photographs from the museum collection to introduce a diversity of ideas, approaches, and technologies that have informed their making. We interviewed artists and curators who offer a variety of perspectives on what a photograph is and the way that photography has been used. And I believe we may have a few Seeing Through Photographs learners here with us tonight, so please come up and say hi afterward. Quentin Bajac became the chief curator of the Department of Photography in January 2013, and although he recently left the museum to become the director of the Jeu de Paume in Paris, in the 6 years he was at the museum, he left an indelible mark. Quentin's first exhibition, A World of Its Own, Photographic Practices in the Studio, underscored the fact that for him, as a French curator, MoMA's historic embrace of street photography, as opposed to studio photography, which had been exemplified by the work of Diane Arbus, Lee Friedlander, and Gary Winogrand in New Documents, was really only half the story. Quentin was also deeply committed to circulating the collection through an active publications program, the most ambitious expression of which are the 3 volumes of Photography at MoMA, co-edited by Quentin, yours truly, and our colleagues Lucy Gallen and Roxana Markoch. This opportunity to reflect on the way in which we use the collection to tell stories that comprise the history of the medium was particularly valuable on the eve of the museum's expansion. When we reopen in October, one of the biggest changes will be the expanded emphasis on the collection, which will be given 30% more gallery space, in addition to being rotated actively. So what people encounter as they walk through the galleries will be a more integrated display, and within 18 months, those displays will be transformed, allowing us to dramatically expand and enrich the ways in which we share our collection with the public. There are 2 artists who feature prominently in the 2nd volume of Photography at MoMA, and who continue, and will continue, to have an active presence in these collection installations, and most of you know them well, Greta Stern and Horacio Coppola. But first, a confession. These 2 works by Horacio Coppola were the first photographs by an Argentine artist acquired for the museum collection. Hard to believe, but true, because they only arrived in 2001 as part of the Thomas Walter collection I just mentioned. I had no context for them beyond their clear relationship to European modernism. Yet the fact that they were made by an Argentine photographer made me curious to understand their story. It was not exactly evident how an English-speaking, New York-based curator might go about doing this. That is, until the museum established a research initiative in 2009 called CMAP. CMAP, which stands for Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives, is an internal, cross-departmental research initiative with the goal of nourishing a more nuanced understanding of the histories and legacies of modernism, with a focus on regions that have been traditionally overlooked by North American and Western European museums and scholars. So it was under the aegis of CMAP that I first traveled to Buenos Aires in September of 2013, when I had the privilege of meeting a number of scholars, curators, writers, and collectors who enriched my understanding of the artistic scene in Buenos Aires in general, and of Coppola's achievement in particular. One of the foundational principles of CMAP is the commitment to ongoing exchange, understanding that the most meaningful relationships are the ones that are developed over time. I was grateful to be able to return with my colleague Roxana Markoch in 2014 to focus on the preparation for our forthcoming exhibition, From Bauhaus to Buenos Aires, Greta Stern and Horacio Coppola. And here's one photograph from that trip at Jorge Mara's gallery, trying to make sure that I didn't forget any details of what I saw. Roxana and I also hosted a study day at which we were honored to have several distinguished speakers, including Veronica Tell, who gave a revelatory presentation about Horacio Coppola's short films. I have always loved this photograph by Coppola, which is just magnificently scaled. It's about 60 centimeters wide. Because this photograph in particular seemed to encapsulate Coppola's twinned interest in photography and film. The surrealist-infused strangeness of this nocturnal view of his hometown is interrupted by a dark horizontal band that is actually a handrail before a large plate glass window, but it appears to be the negative space dividing frames along a strip of film. When we purchased this print in 2014, it was the last work we acquired before the exhibition. And while I'm speaking of acquisitions, I would like to mention a fund that has been critically important in our efforts to develop the presence of work by Latin American artists in the museum collection, which made possible the acquisition of this work by Greta Stern in 2009. with some help from Mauro. Established more than a decade ago by a group of generous supporters, the Latin American and Caribbean Fund has enabled the acquisition of hundreds of important works by artists from across Latin America. The presence of these works in the museum collection has not only enhanced the temporary exhibitions we've organized, such as from Bauhaus to Buenos Aires, but perhaps more importantly, it's also influenced the ways in which we are able to present the many-layered histories of modern art in our collection galleries. From Bauhaus to Buenos Aires marked the culmination of the curiosity sparked by those two Coppola photographs acquired in 2001, 14 years later, I admit, a long time. But it remains an important touchstone for me in thinking about how to present lesser-known achievements to our New York audiences, and then how to integrate a broader range of practices into the fabric of our institution moving forward. So presenting the dynamic interplay between still and moving images in Coppola's work, for instance, or Stern's inventive photo collages alongside the popular magazine Idilio, for which they were made, all of this has a direct effect on some of the display strategies that you'll see when I hope you will visit the museum after we reopen in October. When anyone asks what I do as a curator at MoMA, the basic three elements are what I just described with respect to this project: acquisitions, exhibitions, and here, publications. We are quite strategic about our acquisitions, and we do our best only to acquire photographs, whether they be purchases or gifts, that we think will live an active life at the museum. When we're doing our job well, our acquisitions are soon featured in exhibitions or collection displays. And while there's not always a one-to-one relationship between exhibitions and publications, circulating ideas and art through publications, and on our digital platforms, from seeing through photograph, can I read that one more time? And while there's not always a one-to-one relationship between exhibitions and publications, between circulating ideas and art through publications, and on our digital platform, from seeing through photographs to the museum's website, all of this is central to our medium. So I'm going to give one other brief example of a similar sequence of events. In the mid-1980s, John Tchaikovsky was invited to visit the Joseph Albers Foundation, where he was shown a group of previously unpublished, unique photo collages. He immediately recognized the importance and originality of this unknown work and organized a small exhibition in 1988, accompanied by a modest paperback book. In appreciation of his efforts, the Albers Foundation donated these two prints to the museum, and we put them on view as often as our conservators would allow. But given the near constant demand for these prints, in 2013, we began to have another conversation with the Albers Foundation, which resulted in an acquisition in 2015 of 10 additional photo collages for the collection. This provided a welcome opportunity to study the entire body of work from which these were drawn, and about which many questions had remained. The result was this book, 1 and 1 is 4, the Bauhaus photo collages of Joseph Albers. And whereas for Coppola and Stern, the exhibition had been accompanied by a catalog, in this instance, I'd say the reverse was true. The museum published this handsome book, which was then accompanied by a modest exhibition. In both cases, though, an acquisition was really the key to the project. But there is something even more fundamental to the activities of a curator, more fundamental than acquisitions, exhibitions, or publications. It's something without which none of these would have meaning, and that is research. Without scholarship, we couldn't establish strategic priorities for our acquisitions. We wouldn't be able to make meaningful connection between works of art in our displays, and we wouldn't be able to produce publications that disseminate these discoveries. So here I share a spread from this Joseph Albers book, which features the beginning of a text by my colleague Leanne Daphner, a photography conservator at MoMA. It is her job to help us care for the collection and to treat the photographs that need treatment. But she also helps us approach the photographs in new ways by expanding our understanding of their materiality. Leanne explained to me, for instance, that the cyanotypes, or blueprints, that Albers was making in the mid-1920s were possible to produce without a darkroom, and it was only once he moved into a master's house at the Bauhaus with a darkroom, in fact, the one that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and his wife Lucia had lived in, that Albers began developing out prints from negatives. It's fascinating, but I guess, again, I digress. Let's move on. So research is at the heart of one of my most recent projects, a book about Frances Benjamin Johnston's Hampton Album. Johnston had made a group of photographs at a school for African Americans and Native Americans in Hampton, Virginia in 1899 and 1900. The photographs were widely heralded at the 1900 Paris Exposition as part of a display meant to demonstrate progress, and I use that term with caution, since the abolition of slavery. But alas, these photographs were soon thereafter forgotten. The album was rediscovered in a bookstore in Washington, D.C. during World War II by Lincoln Kirstein, whose amazing story I will have to tell another day. But Kirstein eventually gave the album, without knowing who made the photographs in it, to the museum in 1965. And soon thereafter, Tchaikovsky organized a small exhibition with fewer than a third of the images and a similarly scaled book. Thorny questions of race and representation, of bias embedded in models of education, continue to be important issues that we grapple with today. And we use this treasured object from the museum collection to do this. We just published a deluxe and a trade edition, which for the first time makes all 159 photographs in Johnston's original album available. I wrote one contextual essay, and I invited a young African-American photographer named Latoya Ruby Frazier to contribute her perspective as well, which I believe expands the possibilities for approaches to this important and very complex body of work. Turning back to exhibitions, in 2017, I am proud to have organized this exhibition, Making Space, Women Artists and Postwar Abstraction, with my colleague Star Figueroa in the museum's Department of Drawings and Prints. We presented the stunning achievements of women artists between the end of World War II, 1945, and the start of the feminist movement around 1968. This was a moment when societal shifts had made it possible for larger numbers of women to work professionally as artists, and yet their work was often dismissed in the male-dominated art world, and few support networks existed for them. Abstraction dominated artistic practice during these years, as many artists working in the aftermath of World War II sought to have an international language that might transcend national and regional narratives, and for women, this had the additional benefit of transcending those related to gender. The achievements of artists from South America, women artists from South America, were particularly notable. And in these two views, we see works by Argentine Lili Prati, Venezuelans Elsa Gramco and Gego, Uruguayan Maria Freire, and the Brazilians Gertrudis Altschul and Leisha Clark. But part of what I loved about this exhibition was seeing the impact that these women had on how we see the work of more familiar American artists, such as Louise Nevelson. Or here, the work of Sarah Grillo, nestled between works by Linda Benglis, Eva Hess, and Ruth Asawa in the gallery behind. These are the possibilities and combinations that thrill me, and of which you will find many more examples when the museum reopens, looking across media and across continents to tell new stories. The idea of expanding the ways in which we approach the art we think we know well is perhaps nowhere more present for me than with a research initiative inspired by a 2015 acquisition of the German photographer August Sander's magnum opus, which he called People of the 20th Century. Comprised of more than 600 photographs, this landmark body of work was structured by Sonder in the mid-1920s to encompass nearly 50 portfolios arranged into 7 groups. In 2016, the year after that acquisition, Noam Elcott, an art history professor at Columbia University, and I launched the August Sonder Project, a 5-year research initiative that invites brilliant people across a range of disciplines, artists, poets, writers, curators, historians, all kinds of critical thinkers, to each pick one of Sonder's portfolios and present it according to their own expertise and insight. Almost none of the presenters are Sonder experts. The point is to ask people whose interests are only tangentially related to Sonder to look carefully and think deeply about new ways of approaching his work and understanding its relevance in the 21st century. The photographer Tina Barney presented at our first gathering, and she was so transformed by what she learned and heard that day that she returned the following year to make a series of portraits inspired by the work of August Sonder. So here is my favorite of those, of all of my colleagues in the Department of Photography, and you'll see that our department is about the same size as the entire museum staff was in 1937, so quite a change. I do want to be sure to leave time for your questions, so there are 2 more projects I'd like to mention, if only briefly, to round out your sense of what it's like to be a curator at MoMA. I strongly believe that there is much we can learn from studying previous generations of artists, whether we're talking about Frances Benjamin Johnston, August Sonder, or Dorothea Lange. I recently had an opportunity to write a small book about this one iconic photograph, now known as Migrant Mother, and it surprised me how much we didn't know about this image that is so familiar, at times it's hard to see it for what it is. During the course of my research, I noticed how many different titles had been associated with this image, and some of them are up on the screen, I won't read them all, but also how much contradictory information had appeared alongside it, and we were able to solve several long-standing mysteries. If you're curious to know more, just get me going in the Q&A, and I'm happy to do it. But for now, suffice it to say that this small book project rekindled my interest in Lange, and I knew I wanted to organize a larger exhibition of her work. One angle that seemed to be missing from the scholarship was the one that it could examine the relationship between words and pictures in Lange's work. I knew that this was important for Lange. The end papers for her 1939 landmark photo book, An American Exodus, which she made with her husband, Paul Taylor, are printed with the words spoken by the people she photographed, whose likenesses appear on the pages within. Lange herself observed, quote, "There is no photograph, documentary or otherwise, that isn't fortified by words." And while I disagree with her position, I think there are photographs that are not fortified by words. I find it a fascinating way to approach her career, and fascinating for someone who dedicated their life to making images to make that kind of a statement. So now I'm working on an exhibition that will open in February of 2020, just a few months away, called Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures, and it will examine various combinations of words and pictures, such as An American Exodus, as well as other books, magazines, poems, correspondence, and more. We're also inviting an exciting group of artists, writers, and thinkers, from Wendy Redstar to Rebecca Solnit, from Julie Alt to Sally Mann, to contribute their own words about Lange's pictures, giving us new ways to understand Lange's work and its relevance today. I'll conclude with a brief mention of projects that we are doing with Sarah Swinar and Rosalind Solomon while the museum is closed for construction. And I don't know if anyone came in late, but I'm here in Buenos Aires to talk about how we're reimagining the museum for when we reopen. Artists are truly at the heart of all that we do, and the art that they make is why we do it. So stay tuned, look on MoMA's magazine where you can see more about Sarah and Rosalind's projects. My job as a curator is to care for MoMA's collection, of course, and to provide new ways of understanding the past through it. But it is also to provide a platform for artists living and working today so that we can dream together about the future. Thank you. Muchas gracias. So I'm happy to answer questions, and if you prefer to ask them in Spanish, I have the capacity to understand. Bruno, how do you want to do this?
Si hay alguna pregunta, Sara tiene traducción, se puede hacer en español sin ningún problema. Se escucha, si alguien, ahí hay una pregunta.
The first photograph I bought?
Just a second, please.
Okay.
The lady, ella le preguntaron cuál fue la primera fotografía que compraron.
For me, yeah.
Sara compró.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I remember the first Latin American photograph I ever bought, and it was a work by Juan de Sandro. And I remember seeing it, and it's this incredibly confusing, misty reflection of a plaza that I'm not remembering the name, but I'm sure you all know exactly which one it is. And you see the top and the bottom are imperfectly mirrored in one another. And so you know that they are not actually reflections of one another. So that was certainly the first Latin American photograph that I was responsible for purchasing. Although, I should mention, she asked which was the first photograph that I bought for the museum. I say we in a very loose, generous sense, because I, of course, don't buy anything. I rely very much on an incredibly generous group of people, artists and dealers who give us discounts, and people at the museum who help support these. So if I'm saying I too much, it's really misleading. But thank you. That's a great question.
Bueno, ahí se escucha.
Oh, hold on a second. Let me put on my little earphones.
Sí, te quería preguntar un poco, tendría que dar un rodeo para formular mi pregunta, pero tiene que ver con la relación entre tu tarea como curadora en el MoMA y esto que mencionabas al final de la relevancia de la investigación para pensar y planificar exhibiciones. Me parece interesante cómo al inicio planteaste cómo se crea el departamento de fotografía, un poco buscando distanciarse, o sea, diferenciar otros tipos de arte, otros tipos de medios, y me interesa pensar también contemporáneamente, ahora, cómo se piensa el espacio de exhibición, y digo el diseño exhibitivo para la fotografía, un poco distanciándose también de ese formato que históricamente todos lo conocemos del cubo blanco, tan vinculado a la historia del MoMA, pero si crees que es posible pensar otros formatos expositivos, otros diseños expositivos que se distancien de ese formato más aséptico o neutro que se pretendía con el cubo blanco. No sé si eso.
That's a great question. I'll try, and I hope I understood it. So if I start going off, you can signal, no, that's not what you meant. So I think there were a couple of elements of it. I would say it is, let's begin at the end. You were asking about the sort of purported white cube and the neutrality that none of us believe is a truly neutral space. I think Oh, sorry, I wasn't speaking to them. Sorry, Paulina. Thank you, Paulina, also for doing the translations tonight. I think that the question of the spaces in which we show art, I am really interested. One of the reasons I love looking at these historical exhibition designs is that I think you can learn a lot through that comparison. So whether it's painting walls different colors or hanging photographs in much more constructed design ways, anything you do that helps draw a viewer's attention to the artificiality of that, I think is worth paying attention to. But at the same time, we are a museum. We are not going to be showing work in a domestic setting. We work with exhibition designers to think of ways of evoking, whether it be with a curved corner or a freestanding panel or whatever. So we spend a lot of time thinking about exhibition design, but it is within the framework of the museum in which we work, and I'm comfortable with that because I think that's what people expect when they come to the museum, which doesn't mean that with certain kinds of practices we shouldn't be imagining it differently, but I think that's something that can become from the artist. So whether it's an installation or a site-specific piece or something like that, a billboard for that matter. Oh goodness. So, sorry, I'm just trying to think of another part of the question that I should answer. So you were also asking about the sort of the integration of media, I think, if I understood it correctly, and sort of how historically the museum was very keen to identify a unique defining set of characteristics about photography, what it was that made photography different from everything else at the museum. And I would say that right now, those distinctions, beginning around the Peter Galassi era, seem less essential, at least as a whole. So what I love about the displays of the collection now, or when we reopen in October, is that there will be galleries dedicated to photography, but there will also be many galleries with works that are media, integrated by media, because that was how life and art were happening. And we want to be able to do both of those things. So carving out a space for photography, do I need to worry about whether photography is art? No, not at all. Do I have the privilege, in fact, of doing the opposite, of pointing out how photographs in Idilio magazine or photographs made by an amateur, I have the privilege of looking at those and really investigating what makes those interesting, and makes it a good moment, I think, to be a photography curator. I hope I did justice to that, or at least some of that question. Next time we'll break it into pieces. Okay, I see one. Hi. Oh, sorry. Am I allowed to call on people? Yeah, go ahead. I'm calling them.
Very simple question. I'd love to hear more about what you discovered about the Dorothea Lange.
Sure. Oh.
Because I was able to see her show in Paris last year.
Oh, great. So I can say it and then they'll translate it. Oh no, is that not? Oh, you translate it. Okay. Oh, sorry. She asked a question.
Preguntaron qué descubrió acerca de Dorothea Lange.
De esta particular imagen, ¿no?
De esta imagen particular de madre migrante.
So I wrote a whole book about this. I'll try to distill it into a minute or two. Well, first of all, the book is really wonderful because it's little. It's only this big. It's only 64 pages. I call it a glorified postcard, but it really has a ton of information in it. So one of the things was this iconic image that everyone knows. If you look on the file card, which is the far right picture there, it says a destitute mother of 7 children, age 32, and it says February 1936. And the The date is sometimes given as February, sometimes given as March. Then there are all of these accounts that say that they had just sold the tires of their car for food, they had just sold their tent for food, and there are very, very passionate rebuttals of these facts by the family of Florence Owens Thompson, the woman in this photograph, where her family, they go nuts. They say, no, we drove off the next day, we never sold our tires for food. And the tent, you can see it so clearly in several other variants of this image. I thought, how could there all these captions exist about the tent being sold for food when the tent is clearly there, except when the New York Times whites it out with the airbrush, which is what's happening in the second picture. And on the one next to that, you see they've airbrushed out the tent and made it look like a blue sky with a couple of clouds flitting by, and the children have been removed conveniently. So I knew all these things were not lining up, and I went to the Library of Congress where the negatives are held for this, and I drove those poor librarians crazy. I asked them, I said, how can this be that you, and they said, well, the process is Lange would send in her field notes, and then we would write the captions based on her field notes. And I looked at the field notes that came along with this batch of film, and they never mentioned this woman. They mentioned Nipimo, the town where she was, but it clearly wasn't this encounter. And I said, this just doesn't make any sense. There's no mention of this photograph in her field notes, and she was actually very careful about it. So we kept digging and digging, and they kicked me out. They're like, we can't help you. We've done all we can. And I then started looking in correspondence files, and Roy Stryker, who was the head of a group called the Farm Security Administration, when Lange made these photographs, he was her boss, she would write him letters while she was on the road. And one of the letters she wrote him in February of 1936, she writes, I'm in Nipimo, the rains are about to wash out the roads, I need to get to LA, but this seems very promising, I'll stop again on the way back. So it seems super clear she was in Nipimo in February, then she went to Los Angeles, and although she intended to drive home through, again, there was no mention of that in the field notes. So all we had was I know, sorry, too long, but I can't help myself. We have an account that Dorothea Lange herself gave in 1960, where she wrote of this photograph that she was driving home in the pouring rain, and she passed a sign for a pea pickers camp, but she had been on the road for a month, and she was desperate to get home, and she just passed it. And then 20 miles later, as if drawn by a magnet, it has this sort of apocryphal character, drawn by a magnet, she turned her car around, went back to the pea pickers camp, approached this woman, made 5 exposures. In fact, she made 7, but she only made 5 that she liked. And in that story that Lange told, she repeats, they sold their tires for food, the children were eating off of frozen vegetables and birds they had killed, and Lange in her own story is embedding some of these problems. But what I realized was that the reason there were no field notes was because it was true. She was really rushing home. So whereas she was normally quite diligent about this, if you take her, at least in large part for her word, she was rushing home. She didn't want to take, didn't take any notes. And then the picture, she knew immediately how important it was. She submitted it to the San Francisco News, and to the editor of the San Francisco News alerted the authorities in California. They sent relief to the camp and a reporter, by which time this woman had left. And basically, you start reading in the newspaper reports, including this one on the far left, the stories about this picture. And this was within days of her making the picture. This is March 11th, 1936. And so basically what we discovered is that everyone since April 1936 has been relying on the newspaper reporting from United Press reporters who went to the camp after this woman left. But they were reporting on the general condition of the camp, And because Lange herself hadn't made any notes, these newspaper reports that we dug up from the picture morgue at the San Francisco Public Library, we got these reports and we were able to find all of the references to every factually inaccurate statement about this picture by doing that. Sorry, that was far too long, but it's true.
Yo, durante varios momentos de la charla, usted hizo un especial énfasis en la importancia que tiene para usted y para la colección la materialidad de la fotografía, el problema de la fotografía como objeto versus la fotografía como imagen, que es una cosa que yo encuentro más y más en la preocupación de la fotografía contemporánea, fundamentalmente desde el punto de vista de los galeristas, pienso yo, pero en general, y me sorprende sobre todo en casos en los cuales es artísticamente irrelevante, en el sentido de que son fotos que fueron producidas para medios editoriales y no hay forma de reconstruir un original a partir de eso, porque más allá del negativo, la copia no tiene ninguna importancia, e incluso hoy, cuando ni siquiera existe el negativo, no hay una materialidad, digamos, natural de la cuestión. ¿Qué importancia tiene artísticamente la materialidad de una foto, si es que tiene alguna?
That's a really excellent question. And I think it points to something, it is not for me to determine whether that materiality is relevant to an artist. So there are artists for whom the materiality is irrelevant, and that's its own kind of materiality. In other words, when you, the decision to show a photograph on a screen, or to have it circulate only online, or to print it in a magazine, those are decisions that artists make, and it's my job to respect them. So I think even what you might call the non-materiality of the photographic image, which is true, which is a thing, and which is something we increasingly grapple with, when you think about what the presence of that kind of an image should play in a museum exhibition or in a museum collection, then you have to make choices. And my only time when I'm skeptical is when an artist doesn't seem to have thought through why they don't care. In other words, you can care or you don't have to care, but if you don't care, to pretend that printing something this big or as big as this screen, to pretend that that's the same thing, to me, unless that speaks in some way to the meaning of the work, that is not applying the judgment that I think is sort of the last step of making an art. And I get, it's really, we collect photographers' work where there isn't, we collect artists' work where there isn't a materiality or where it's a temporal thing. Nan Goldin's Ballad of Sexual Dependency is a slide projection. It doesn't, it has characteristics that evoke a materiality, but it is not itself, it's an ephemeral thing. Or David Horowitz circulated a picture of himself on Wikipedia with his head in his hands, and it became associated with depression. And then he reverse searched for this image, and that internet presence is the work, and that's fine too. I'm very interested in photographer. I mean, it's okay with me, whatever. My job isn't to say to an artist, your job has to be able to get old the way an old photograph did. And it's not to say to an artist, your job has to fit into our cold storage, or, there are all kinds of interesting problems that artists create for us, and it's our job to say, that's super interesting, you know, now what do we do? Is that answering your question or not answering your question?
Yes, absolutely. I just solo tengo una pregunta más. ¿Qué pasa, por ejemplo? Por ejemplo, la fotografía digital que hoy en día se imprime, supónganse una fotografía de Gursky, por decir algo, en la cual nadie manda una fotografía, sino que manda un archivo que se imprime nuevo para la exposición, y la forma de verlo es impreso ayer a la tarde para que esté recién ploteado para la exposición. ¿Qué sentido tiene conservar eso más allá de un archivo? ¿Tiene sentido tener el objeto fotográfico tal como el artista quiere que se presente y se decaiga con el tiempo? ¿O habría que volver a imprimirlo dentro de 50 años para una exposición si se hiciera de vuelta? Perdón, pero es muy largo. ¿Entiende lo que quiero decir?
Oh, I mean, you couldn't be talking about things I think about more, because the truth...
I hate the vintage print. I'm the mystic of the vintage
it's
print.
Fair enough. I mean, when, as I said, the family of man, those prints, Dorothea Lange described walking into the family of man, and she said that when you touched the prints on the walls, the paste would squeeze out the side. They were that newly printed and mounted. So I agree that the fetish of the vintage print needs to be understood in terms of its historic specificity. And that historic specificity does not mean that everything old is a precious vintage print, nor does it mean that you can't make an exhibition print today and assign to it a different kind of value. And these are where I struggle is when I think Edward Steichen and the exhibition designers that he worked with took liberties with photographs that the makers of those photographs might not have felt that their choices in terms of materiality, scale, context, meaning were respected. And so if you and I are working together and you tell me you don't care, you want it to look big this day, then you want to tear that down and you don't want anyone to keep it, my job is to say, okay, so it's you really need to be specific, and that's what I was saying. What matters to me is not that it happens one way or another. In the Stephen Shore retrospective that we did, we had iPads with Stephen Shore's Instagram feed on them in the galleries, because for him, that's one of the ways in which he makes art today. It has no print, ever. But he does give a lot of thought to that square boundary around those images, and I respect that thought that he gives, even if eventually, it's a conservator's nightmare, but again, that's our problem, not yours. Unless nobody wants to keep it, in which case, we won't worry about it either.
Bueno, con este problema ya no tenemos más tiempo, así que queríamos agradecerle a Sara, agradecerle a todos que pudieron venir. Y bueno,